Come and join me around the fire as we sing of Boulder the Beautiful, how he was loved and how he died. Runes shalt you find, and fateful signs that the king of singers colored and the mighty gods have made. Fateful signs are in the dreams of Boulder that showed him his own death. Fateful signs can be found in the love of a mother who took oaths from all things. Fateful signs, often overlooked, like mistletoe and the blind, sow mischief among us all. I present you with Fateful Signs. Boulder, the son of Odin and Frigg, the husband of Nanna, and the father of Forseti, dreamed of his own death. It was said that Boulder was the most beautiful of the gods, beloved by all, but most of all, loved by his mother, Frigg. When Frigg learned of Balder's dreams, she went to all the things of the world and took oaths from each that they would not harm her Balder. And all agreed, except mistletoe, an unseemly plant that was overlooked. In their arrogance, the gods used Boulder for weapons practice. In his jealousy, Loki tricked the blind god Höður to throw a mistletoe dart, killing Boulder. And so, Boulder went to Hell, where he resides until after Ragnarok.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mathias Nordvig, expert on pre-Christian Scandinavian mythology and religion at the University of Colorado, Boulder.
Hey there, and I'm Sam Flegal. I am a fantasy illustrator who's done a number of work in games, but recently switched my focus to Norse mythology. I do a series called Fateful Signs, which is a number of oil paintings that I do. And today we're talking about Boulder. You did a video, I guess a few months back that was all about, I think you called it, Is Boulder the Sun God? And I've also recently just finished a painting that I called The Death of Boulder. And I thought it would be interesting for us to just kind of talk about that. And so as we're talking, I'm going to switch over here to some scenes of me painting. And so you guys watching at home will get to see an oil painting come to life as Mathias and I have a conversation here. So I'm curious, what would you say are the biggest misconceptions about Boulder in the more common stories that most people would know?
I think, in my opinion, it's definitely this idea that Boulder is a god of light and has something to do with the sun. Now, this is not because I think that it's, if you, for instance, are a neo-pagan practitioner and Ausatru or something like that, and that's how you want to associate that particular deity in your personal spirituality. It's more, what do the sources actually say about this figure? So one of the reasons that this interpretation of Boulder is sort of popular is that it's one of the oldest popularized interpretations. We have it by scholars already back in the 19th century, where there was a general tendency to believe that Nordic mythology and other such nature religions, as they were called back then, were all about sun worship. And so what we see is a lot of scholars interpreting myths as allegories about the sun.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So the story about Boulder in that regard is interesting because, well, we have this, we have some components that do seem to go along the lines of that, and also relate to Greek mythology. The idea that, for instance, when Boulder dies in Snorri Sturluson's, he goes to the underworld, and then gods try to retrieve him, bring him back. And the caveat here, the deal is that Hel, the goddess of the underworld, then says, you have to make everything cry for Boulder, then I'll bring him back. And this crying aspect, that everything cries, has been interpreted as that rainy, wet period you get in Northern Europe in the fall period, When summer is over, any Scandinavian and Northern German knows this. Like all of a sudden, all you have is like gray, rainy weather for like 3 months, and then you get a little snow.
All right. Oh,
That's part of the backdrop for that early interpretation of the myth, and I mean, it's in many ways a valid interpretation. You can always interpret a myth as an allegory in various contexts, but I feel personally that and so do a lot of other scholars, of course, also that overlooks a lot of aspects of the story.
Okay, so you went into this pretty in depth in your video, but my big takeaway that I thought was fascinating about Snorri as taking us on a journey, and that basically a big part of that journey is, you know, the stories right before the death of Boulder, the gods are failing. You know, there's the story of Thor dealing with Utgard Loki and being tricked and all of that kind of stuff, and then you mentioned Thor trying to capture the Midgard serpent, and then basically these series of stories, and then ultimately Baldur's death leading into Ragnarok, where all the gods ultimately fail. And you pointed out something that I had honestly never considered, which was this was Snorri's way of saying Ragnarok has already happened. The Norse gods are over. That is the old way. That's the old time. And then, you know, what's next? And then we do have that sort of Christ-like resurrection of Balder, which, you know, many people have said, you know, that part, especially at the end, feels a lot less rooted in the Norse way or the Norse lore, and coming out of that. So I'm curious to get your thoughts a little bit on that.
Yeah, so what we should keep in mind here is that we actually have another source to the story about Boulder.
And that'd be Saxo, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a very different story. And a lot of scholars have said, oh, well, that perspective that Saxo gives right there is of course, you know, based off his own distaste for the Nordic gods. Saxo, when he writes about the Nordic gods, is not positive at all. And that, you know, people have tended to contrast that with Snorri, who seems much more favorable or positive in his descriptions. I mean, both of them are Christian writers, right? So they would have some kind of Christian attitude, right? What we need to understand with Nordic mythology is, of course, that Nordic mythology is written into a specific context of thinking about the Nordic gods. And Snorri Sturluson tells us this straight up in his prologue. He says, well, the Nordic gods are not gods, they're humans. That's a way he, as a Christian, gets around dealing with that touchy subject of paganism.
Right.
And then he says, and they're actually humans who came from Troy, which was a very common myth in the medieval period. We can go all the way back to Caesar, actually in classical Rome in the antiquity, to see how the myth of descent from Troy starts spreading. The Roman rulers favored this myth as their origin. We see the Frankish rulers do the same thing later on, some 500, 600, 700 years later, and then of course we also see the Nordic peoples doing the same thing. So what happens is that well, the Nordic gods, they were, you know, there was probably an idea that the kings descended from Odin. We see that in genealogies, both in the Old English context and also in Scandinavia. And then we translate that into that story of like Odin was one of those people who got out of Troy when Troy fell back in the day, and then he came to Scandinavia and he set up this religious system because, you know, he was a little cooler than the rest of people, and he could do some magic, and also he brought a lot of gold and awesome things from, you know, that enchanted place down south that we as, you know, these northerners don't really know about. We just know that they have, you know, more awesome things than we do, and that goes into all of this. And so what Snorri actually is saying in that part where he gives us the story about Balder's death, and the story about how Thor fails as the strongest and most awesome god out at Utgaraloki's hall, and all of that stuff, is actually that these stories represent versions or aspects of the destruction of Troy. He says straightforward that Ragnarok in and of itself is the story about how Troy fell. So that's the context we need to see this myth in, actually, because that's how he's interpreting this. He gives in Skaldskaparmál, the section of the Edda that comes after the story where we have Ragnarok in Gylfaginning. He actually says that the story about Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent is an allegory over Achilles fighting some person named Volocrontes. And we don't really know who Volocrontes is because that figure is not recorded in the classical tradition. But that's also part of this. These medieval authors had a tendency to invent new characters and put into the story of Troy.
Sure.
So in that sense, that's really how all of this comes about for Snorri as this Christian author. Of course, he wants to give us or his audience what he believes is sort of a true account of the Nordic myths. He's not a conniving, at least I don't think so, that he's this conniving conspiratory author who's like, let me change all of this so that
certainly not. And I always took the idea what he was really trying to do was preserve his cultural poetry. And there's such a huge section on how to compose the various ways that poetry should be done. I mean, even one of the only references to Galder and how to do a Galdic poem is actually something that Snorri preserved. So, all that stuff is if we're going to preserve this poetry, first you need to know these stories so you understand the kinnings. And so I don't think it was malicious at all. I think he had a true love for the stories, but in the way that a Christian likes fairy tales, right? It's not the preservation of divinity; it's the preservation of cultural heritage. And but I agree. I think no one would write that much about something that they hated, right?
Right.
But both you and I have involved in our own projects, and I can tell you from personal experience, the amount of time you sit with something like that, it would be highly unlikely to not love it, at least in some way. Exactly.
That's the thing. When you found a subject that you love, you come to a point where you just can't not do it, right? And even if the project that you might be working on doesn't really go anywhere or something like that, you still just do it because it's your love for the subject, right? And I think Snorri Sturluson was very much the same kind of person. Based on what we know about the man, who lived in the early 13th century, he wasn't educated in the sense of a church education. He probably didn't know Latin. He did receive education as part of his upbringing, living with Jón Loftsson, who was a very important church figure in medieval Iceland, at Oddi, which was also a center of learning. So he would have had access to all of this interesting knowledge from books that came from the Mediterranean, had been copied by scribes over a century or two, and that's where he picked up all the knowledge that he put into fashioning these stories about the Nordic gods, and he definitely loved skaldic poetry. He composed the longest skaldic poem, Hautatal, which is this excursion in all the various forms of skaldic poetry. You don't do that if you don't love the stuff.
Yeah, precisely. So I'm curious. So we mentioned Saxo's version just a little bit, and I only have a cursory knowledge there, but I do know that in Saxo's version, Boulder is a warrior, and he's a womanizer, and the traits he takes on, what stood out to me is he's so much more Odinic in that version of things, much like his father, or however you want to look at that, because in that story too, he's also just a warrior. He's not the son of a god or anything like that.
I mean, Saxo's version is sort of like a story more of like a warrior slash aristocratic intrigue. So Saxo operates with the same notion that these gods are were in fact humans, and they were kings, and for him they were tyrants too. That's something he says very explicitly, that they sort of like oppressed the Scandinavian populations.
Of course.
Right. I mean, that's definitely the Christian perspective that's coming out. And Saxo, on the other hand, as opposed to Snorri, he writes in Latin. He knows Latin. He knows Latin literature, and he's also a man of the clergy. He's employed to write this stuff by Bishop Absalon of Denmark, who was one of the most influential bishops. He founded Copenhagen, among other things. So he was
oh wow,
an important figure, yeah.
And so what time period is Saxo writing roughly?
Just before Snorri. He writes in the late 1100s to the sometime into the mid 10s.
Okay.
I think the latest date I've seen for when he's writing is 1208. So they're very close in time, and they probably definitely did not know each other, but they did know some of the same material. Saxo says this too. He says that he is using Icelandic material because the Icelanders have this thirst for knowledge, and he praises their intellectual capacity too. And Snorri would be an example of that great intellectual capacity that you see in Iceland in this period of time. I personally have a lot of admiration for the guy, that the stuff that he actually managed to pull off as a medieval, not a part of the church, is impressive, in terms of creating books and literature. The story that Saxo gives is this story that Boulder is a womanizer. He sees Hertha's wife, and he's like, hello there. And then he tries to get with her, and then all of that turns into jealousy and intrigue, and then a war. In Saxo's version of Nordic mythology, which is by the way, in many ways an awesome source to Nordic mythology, that is a veritable cornucopia of auxiliary knowledge in so many ways that people seem to overlook, unfortunately. He gives us this story that sort of is the culmination of the oppression of the Scandinavian peoples by these Nordic gods, where all of this ends with a big battle, where the gods are part of the battle. Thor is like throwing a giant hammer around. All of these things are part of that story, and so that's like an entirely different perspective, where Boulder is definitely not supposed to be a nice guy. He's sort of a elite aristocrat who thinks he can do whatever he wants, and does not care about ideals and nobility and such things instead, right?
What strikes me hearing you talk about this is interesting is it feels like both Snorri and Saxo are kind of doing in their time what many modern authors do in our own time, where when you have, I guess the oldest source we have being the Poetic Edda, and you look at those poems, and boy, those poems leave a lot of questions, and so you start filling in your own answers to those questions. And Saxo was doing that in his own way, and Snorri also did that in his own way a little bit later.
Absolutely.
We
And
look
also,
back. Yeah.
also in the pre-Christian times, like before Christianity becomes part of all of this, I'm sure people were doing that too. You have this pool of knowledge, right? You have individuals in society who have who have been trained in some kind of capacity, definitely a religious capacity too, in context of the pre-Christian religion, who then also add their own parts to this material, because that's their right, that's their ability, that's their function in society, right? um, so and what guys like Snorri and Saxo have available to them is, of course, the leftovers of all of this, because they don't have all of it, right?
Sure.
They have the stories that have that are circulating in the general intellectual sphere, so to speak, or the literature of their time, where they have access to stories that have been deemed okay by the church for different reasons, right? And so that's also something we should take into consideration. But the story about Boulder is believed to be much older than that medieval literature. We have the depictions of at least a figure who is being shot by an arrow made from a branch on the golden bracteates from the 400s, so much earlier, from the migration period. So the story does seem to have existed back then, and then of course it does have its roots in what we could sort of call an authentic paganism or pre-Christian religion of Northern Europe. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what could the story then perhaps mean? What could it be about, right? If we strip it from all the Christian interpretation and the way that Snorri Sturluson has placed it in that that sequence that leads up to Ragnarok. So first of all, if we go to the poem Völuspá, which is probably the oldest poem of the collection of Eddic poetry, it's probably from the late 900s. Well, the death of Boulder plays a role in that story. That it is a part of the Ragnarok apocalypse in that story too. Whether it had the same function as Snorri gives it, that's another subject. But it exists there, and that of course tells us then that it was probably on the minds of people back in the late 900s, where they were still largely non-Christians and pagans. And then what about that time span from like the 400-500s to up to that point? That's what is really exciting and interesting to think about, right?
Which is a long stretch of time. I mean, a story, especially with an oral tradition, I mean, it could change so much over a
Exactly,
400 or 500 period.
But we should also keep in mind that there's also a possibility for a lot of accuracy in oral traditions.
Oh, okay.
Especially when it comes to poetry and skaldic poetry as a type of oral quote unquote literature, has been composed to be highly memorable. You can't really change the words out in skaldic poetry, because that would make the meaning implode, and also the meter would fall apart for that. So that means that the older skaldic poems, none of which are a source to the story about Boulder, but this is just to give you some background. These older skaldic poems probably haven't changed that much or at all from the time they were composed until they were written down in the medieval period.
Wow.
So yeah, that's really impressive, and that's something to keep in mind. Now, this is not the case with most of Eddic poetry. Eddic poetry is a lot looser in that regard, so you can change out words, and some composer composes a poem that then lives on in oral tradition. We have the next generation repeating the poem in different contexts, and then the person in charge of doing that forgets a word or it changes a bit and so on. That definitely happens with Eddic poetry and the different kinds of meter you have there. But it is part of sort of the overall function of poetry to be memorable, and we all know this because as soon as we have gone through a grocery store and listened to the music that they play in the radio, we typically have that stuff hanging in our head afterwards, right?
Sure. Well, and especially I was thinking about the nursery rhymes that we all get when we're younger, and in many cases, it's you don't hear again for decades sometimes, but the minute you hear that first line of the poem, you can say the whole poem because it was something you got ingrained in you when you were so young.
Exactly. And also the memory of this stuff ties into emotions. And one of the most powerful things to make us remember is actually emotions too. So yeah, it all combines to be actually very memorable. And so we have like this period of time from like the 400s approximately, where this poem or a poem about this figure who dies is present and important. And if we sort of like broaden our perspective here when it comes to literature, we can see that there are so many stories, folk tales about two brothers, right? We know them from Grimm's fairy tales too. The two brothers, where one suffers tragedy, typically through some kind of jealousy interaction, is a very common narrative. And of course, why not? I mean, this is something that humans have experienced
for sure
all the time, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of like the meaning of the Boulder myth, and also meaning that can be taken from Snorri's version and even from Saxo's version, we should probably be looking for that the sort of a more of like a quote unquote eternal story about that drama between brothers who are fighting. And that's also something that we see in the Ragnarok myth. It does, just before Ragnarok comes, one of the things that the poet says is that bræður munu berjast, brothers will fight, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that's something that was definitely on the minds of the peoples living in Scandinavia at the time. It's also this the whole feuding system, the system where you take revenge upon revenge upon revenge in order to protect your family, is part of why Iceland in the medieval period sort of implodes as a society, because when everybody is related, of course, that's when brothers start fighting. So this was also something that the medieval Christians in Iceland realized. Oh, wow, this Ragnarok myth is actually kind of playing out in social terms among us right now. that was something that some of the people in the 13th century, when we have the Sturlung age and the Civil War age happening, they were actually realizing this. So that's also something to keep in mind, that just because this was perceived as pagan, and maybe they had to like put all of this material into contexts that sort of circumvent the whole this is heathen material situation, they also took knowledge from it. They also used it as lessons for their own time. And yet that's, I think, is where the sort of like the more timeless aspect of the myth of Boulder comes in. So imagine, for instance, that we have this story in the 400s or 500s, and it's this sort of monumental story about intrigue between brothers. It's a story about how jealousy can bring down a great hero. A theme that we certainly also see in so much other literature that has its root in that time. Sigurd the Dragon Slayer is another great example of this. Well, then it starts making sense, because if we go to the story then in Snorri's version, Well, we have this situation where we're told that Boulder has dreams of his own death. And his mother, Frigg, then decides, well, I will protect this deity or my son. I will protect my son as best as possible. So she goes out and she asks all the things in the world to take an oath not to harm him. And she, of course, then forgets the mistletoe because it's an unseemly plant. And then the result is, of course, some kind of hubris, right? Because what are the gods doing then? Oh, he can't die. Let's throw things at him. And so part of the morality of the story is, first of all, well, I would interpret it in this way at least. One thing is, as we also see Odin saying in Hávamál, don't worry too much about your own death. That's an important function here. That's an important message that is coming out. You shouldn't worry too much about when you're going to die or how you're going to die and all of these things, because that will eventually take you away from life itself.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that is an important lesson in this context too. Okay, so what is the next step? Well, the next step is that if you worry too much about yourself dying or your offspring dying, then you go to these extreme measures to prevent that. And the lesson of life is that you can't, right? You can't coddle the next generation too much. They also have to stand on their own 2 feet, and they have to go out there and learn their own lessons. And if you try to shield them too much from that, well, boom, that's when you have a situation where they don't understand the realities of life enough to be able to negotiate dangerous situations. And that's when you have Thor throwing his hammer in the face of Boulder. You have Utler shooting an arrow. You have Odin throwing a spear, and it's all good up until the point that somebody stands out there in the periphery of all of this, and they can't see what's happening because Herc happens to be blind, right? And Loki, who in this story at least represents that type of deviousness that comes from jealousy, that comes from envy. He goes to Herc because Herc has that weakness that he can't see what he's doing. And then jealousy, envy uses that weakness against this person who is sort of performing the epitome of hubris, right? And that's when the arrow is shot, and that's when Boulder dies. And I mean the description that Snorri gives us in the original version of the story is beautiful, because like it's almost sort of like a stop motion kind of scene where Boulder falls down and lands, and all the gods are speechless. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. There's no words left for them to say, because he was such a great warrior. He was such a noble figure. He was the best of them all, right? And now he's dead. And so I think that's such a it's such a powerful message. It's such a powerful lesson that Boulder dies right there in that situation, telling us basically that, you know, you should also cherish those things and people in your life, in our society, who do these great things, who represent these great things. And I think that's part of it too. And then, of course, there's the other part of this story where Hermodr, another son of Odin, travels to Hell, to the underworld, talks to the goddess Hel, and asks her, what can I do to bring him back? And she says, make everything cry for Boulder. And again, the lesson here is, 1, you can't bring people back from the dead. 2, you can't necessarily expect everybody to show the same reverence for such a great figure as Boulder. Regardless of how awesome you think he is, there's always going to be somebody who doesn't like him for one reason or another, right? That's sort of a part of that lesson that comes from Thuk, who does not want to cry for him.
Yeah, sure.
I think in sort of to sum it all up, I think that the story here is about a much more universal aspect of human life. All of these things that come with drama, intrigue, brothers fighting, jealousy, envy, and our personal, like, human desire to try to hold on to things that you just can't hold on to in the end.
Yeah, for sure. So in my own research, there's a few things I found that I'd be interested to get your thoughts on. And so in the painting that I've been working on, I chose to put a Volknut over Baldur's heart to show his connection to Odin, and so that as he's being stabbed, he's actually being stabbed in the Volknut. And some of the things that stood out to me is that Baldur's story is in many ways like a number of heroes who work for Odin in some way, where they have this period of glory, and then at a key moment, something goes terribly wrong and they die. And of course, the idea being, like, Odin's people eventually get called to Valhalla, I guess, like that's part of that story. But then the other thing I think is interesting when you start digging into research on Hod is a number of Odin's names also mean the blind one. And so I've always found that interesting, of like Odin's children as various states of being of Odin as well. And you don't see that so much with Thor, but even like Hermund, who you mentioned, he gets to ride Sleipnir and travel across to the realm of the dead, which is something that only Odin is supposed to be able to do. And then, like Vidar, who avenges his father, and Hod, who's also a blind god, and Odin having that same title, and even Balder being kind of the kingly version of Odin in all of that. And then I also love that line from the Hávamál, which is, I sacrificed myself to myself, right? And so the way I went with it is the idea of Balder being this allegory for Odinic sacrifice. And so I'd just be curious to get some of your thoughts on that, because I'm sure you've done quite a bit more research than I have.
So I very much like that approach, and I agree with you. In so many ways, Boulder, of course, also represents that. So just to go a little to the etymology of his name, I think there's of course been a discussion back and forth. What does his name mean? But I think scholarship has sort of landed on the interpretation that it means the brave one, or something in that realm, so to speak, semantic realm. So Boulder definitely represents a warrior in that sense. He, as you say, he is along with these other figures that are tied to Odin, both in the mythology, but also in more like saga narratives and other types of stories. He belongs to this whole concept of Odin, who is a god of kings, god of warriors, god of magic, god of death to some extent, and yeah, they all suffer terribly at some point, because that is the fate of the warrior. That is the fate of this Odinic figure in the literature and the whole tradition in general, which tells us, I think, a very important part of the realizations that people had back then. We have a tendency nowadays to glorify these Viking warriors and all that stuff, and some people might even think that it sounds pretty cool to have been that. But I think these people had a very real realization of exactly what life was. That there is a huge element of sacrifice involved here. Sacrificing yourself to yourself, absolutely, but also sacrificing yourself to Odin.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sort of reminded of some of the descriptions that we see in the literature of Valherk, the Hall of the Slain, in the early versions in skaldic poetry. It's not a glorious place. It's not
interesting.
Yeah, it's not that that sort of more like cartoonish version that we see in Sturluson Zeta. It's a euphemism for the battlefield.
Yeah.
And
that's something I've heard before, the idea that, most Scandinavian people would actually have been preferred to be buried at their homes in the burial mounds of their people, and that idea of like the ancestral hall being more important, and that Valhalla was what happened when you died, when you were in a battle somewhere away from home, and Valhalla is kind of like the consolation prize in that way.
Yeah, and I think that that might be a very reasonable way of interpreting the mindset of the peoples back then. I mean, consider that most of these rune stones from the Viking Age, they were raised over people who fought and died during. There's like this typical way, almost formulaic way of saying it on the rune stones, when kings were fighting out abroad somewhere in Östervägers and the Eastern Way or something like that, right? These monuments are often raised over these dead warriors, and that is an important feature, right? That runestone, that commemorative ritual that is involved in creating the runestone, is part of trying to bring that person back to the ancestral lands.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's I don't think that these warriors, Viking warriors back then, they were necessarily glorifying it as much as they were just speaking about this in sort of like a circumlocutory realistic way. It's like the Hall of the Slain is that battlefield where we're all gonna lie dead, bloody, and the Valkyries will show up and take our spirits to Odin, and then we will have eternal warfare after that. It's that's pretty hardcore. And some of the descriptions that we see of warriors coming back from the dead in the saga literature are also so bloody and gory. Warriors that are ice cold because they're in the grave, right? They come from the grave. They have blood all over them and icicles in their hair, and people were very much aware of the reality of all of this, and they did not necessarily glorify it any more than they definitely knew what kind of end you would have.
Yeah, well, and I'd say aside from those modern people who actually are in the armed service, most of us are so much further removed from death than those people would have been who had to clean up a battlefield or had to bury their own, and all the practices around whatever their funeral rites would have been. So of course
and consider that child mortality rate was more than 50%.
Oh wow. Yeah.
I mean, people were dying left and right all the time. Death was very close to life in the medieval period, in the Viking Age and before. People were used to seeing, first of all, consider that a typical family, you would have 7 or 8 kids, right? And you would see several of them die off. Living beyond the age of 7 was quite a feat in and of itself. And just think about this, in modern society, we get a staph infection, and we can then take antibiotics, but that did not exist back then. You could die from a staph infection, from the flu, all of these things that are, things that we nowadays are just used to brushing off. Like you get the flu, you're down for a week, and then you're up again. Or you get a flu shot, right? That was not the case for these people. So they had death very close to themselves, right? And of course, then that also means that they would need stories to deal with that.
Yeah.
we always need stories to deal with the hard things in life. And if we look at the story, and especially Frigg's role in Baldur's death in Snorri's version, well, then I feel like that makes a lot of sense, right? That it talks is straight to that mother who would risk losing her child prematurely, thanks to all of these things that could kill you back then.
Right. So one aspect of the story I'm curious about from perhaps the earlier stories or poetry, in Snorri's version, of course, Balder is resurrected, and I know in the Völuspá as well, one of the last couple lines is about Balder rising up to become the king after Odin's death. So I'm just curious, are there any other references to that sort of resurrection? That part, just to me, it always stuck out as being very Christ-like in
Right.
in Snorri's version, but obviously in the Völuspá it does mention it as something that happened. So I don't know, just curious about that.
So speaking of Christ-like, the Völuspá as a poem is probably syncretistic. So there are many interpretations of the poem and its relationship to Christianity. I favor the one that John McKinnell has proposed. John McKinnell is one of my favorite scholars of Nordic mythology from England, and he has proposed that Völuspá was actually composed by a pagan who knew about, especially the story of the apocalypse,
Okay.
in the late pagan period, and so yeah, there would be perhaps motifs that have been sourced from Christianity in that regard. Now, personally, I don't think that the part where Balder and Hertha, for that matter, come back is necessarily a part of that. You have to consider that so many peoples across the planet have stories about the end of the world. First of all, that's not something that is typically Christian.
Sure.
So that's one thing. So that means, of course, and we also see this in plenty of Indo-European traditions, of which the Nordic tradition is part of that whole complex. We see these stories of apocalypses too. So I believe that probably the Scandinavians have had this story of how the world's going to end in some way or another, since the dawn of time. But of course, when Christianity shows up, this subject changes for them. It has another meaning. But you can still see sort of the traditional older way of perceiving this, just like we see it in Vedic mythology. The idea is that, well, at some point the world is going to come to an end because some sort of subject of corruption is part of this, right? And then, the world is end, and we have sort of the world ends, and then we have sort of this purifying process when a new world will then come to life in this cyclical process. That's how they were thinking about things. That life was cyclical, not linear. And Christianity adds the linear aspects to thinking about life and existence. That does not seem to have been a thing before, actually. And so it makes sense to these peoples back in the pre-Christian era to have a situation where, for instance, Boulder dies and then is resurrected afterwards, because the idea is that there's a new world that's going to come after this quote unquote purifying fire that definitely happens in Ragnarok, and that's when we see reconciliation, right? So this is very interesting, because it's a message of forgiveness and reconciliation too, when we have these two brothers coming back and in that new world find peace. so again, that also has a message and sort of learning components to teach you if you are those brothers in that Viking Age society, right? And that you can find reconciliation after having fought each other, which is also something again that we see the Icelanders realizing in their legal processes and the feuding processes. Hey, wait a minute. It might actually be better to choose the road of reconciliation over the road of fighting each other forever.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's a lot of lessons to learn from that don't necessarily have a Christian component, because it's a common human thing to realize at some point that it's better to choose the way of peace than the way of war.
Yeah.
And we also should consider that there are several versions of the poem Völuspá out there. We have the one in the compilation of Eddic poetry called the Codex Regius compilation. And that one is sort of the one that is considered the classical version. Then we have the one that Snorri Sturluson quotes, which is different from that one in the Codex Regius version. There are different, and we don't know exactly if it's Snorri Sturluson who changes things here and there, or if it's the tradition that he knows that he's just quoting. So there are these two versions, first of all. And then we also have the Herc version, which is from the early 1300s. And the Herc version is interesting because that one has inserted that stanza about the king that comes from heaven after Ragnarok. And that king is most certainly Christ.
Yeah, sure.
He's known in the poem, he's called Inriki, and then means the king. So that tells me at least that in the early 1300s, when Haukur Erlendsson compiled his manuscript, that's the name of the guy who made that manuscript, that compiles a lot of different interesting stories, hence the name Hercsbok. It means the book of Haukur. He or someone around him decided, this poem is too pagan for us. We need to insert. So that's just something to take into consideration here. That the medieval tradition kind of looks at this poem and it's like, that's a very pagan poem. So I think you could definitely, you don't have to see this resurrection of Boulder in the poem as something that has been influenced by the Christ myth. At least the medieval tradition didn't. They were like, we need Christ in this, otherwise it's not going to work.
Okay, no, that's good. That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, so I mean that also then sort of gives a little more credence to this interpretation, this natural nature mythological interpretation that Boulder could be an allegory for something that has to do with the cycle of nature too. That he will come back, and if we want to go that route, then he sort of represents a fertility god, I guess, that comes back after that dead period, that is the winter period, where we all hunker down and just wait for the sun and the light and the fertility powers to bring back all the green happiness in the world. That is definitely something that was on the minds of Scandinavians too, and it's the case for so many other peoples too. When you live up in those latitudes, you love the sunlight, man.
Yeah. It also strikes me in mind that the idea that death in the mythological sense doesn't necessarily mean the physical death that we experience as humans. It could also be that idea of he was the young, reckless warrior who died, and his mother was sad, and then he returns as a wiser, older man, perhaps with more of the trappings of middle age or like full adulthood as well. So it could also be viewed under that lens.
Absolutely. And that's something you should also consider, going back to what you were talking about with like these Odinic warriors. So many of these stories that we find in the sagas and the poems and elsewhere, their general subject is initiation ritual.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the warrior goes through a process. So one of the examples of this type of like Odinic initiation, right, is and the symbolic death is when Siegfried and Sinfjot, they live out there in the woods in a den as wolves, right? That is a structural death right there. When you're excluded from society and you're living sort of in the antithesis to the organized realm, that would be the forest. You're living in the antithesis to a house, that would be a hole in the ground. And you're existing as the antithesis to a human as an animal, right? So like the complete inversion of human life in this story. And then you return after that. And the point is, of course, that upon returning, you have experienced important lessons.
Right.
And that's why we see in so many cultures and so many types of myths this need to go to the underworld. You have to take a trip to the underworld in order to gain knowledge. That's also what Odin does. If we go to the myth of the meat of poetry, he has to go into that mountain, all the way into the bottom of the mountain, and then he has to hang out with Gunnlöd, and that's how he gets the meat of poetry. That's death too. The mountain represents the cosmos. You go from top to below, and in that below world, that is a source of knowledge. It like eternal knowledge, and of course that it makes a lot of sense because the dead are the ones who retain the experiences of history, right? That's where you find history. That's with the dead.
Yeah,
So
that's powerful,
right? So that's also that's why the wells are also so important in Nordic mythology. Urð's well at the foot of the tree of Yggdrasil is sort of like a well of knowledge, and Urður is a warden of death too. And Odin has to pledge his eye in Mimir as well. Mimir means memory, and then he gets a drink of it. And that is sort of a variation over that theme of the meat of poetry too, and retrieving it from the underworld. So yeah, it's incredibly powerful. And the warrior, of course, in order to first of all become a warrior, had to undergo some kind of initiation ritual that included that structural death for him, being excluded from society and being reintegrated into society after this period, quote unquote, in the underworld. And that's when they come back as knowledgeable individuals. And again, I would presume that these, at least the early warrior societies in Northern Europe and the Germanic area, they probably had a reintegration ritual for a warrior who had left society for war. I mean, we were talking about a fully fledged, trained warrior. Now it's time to go to battle. And then you come back. And in order to come back, there was probably a very long and important ritual process to bring them back to that type of society. Because there is a sharp distinction to them between civilized society and warrior society. And yeah, and these things only start converging in the Viking Age when sort of more Southern European military culture becomes part of Scandinavian society. This is something that when people glorify the Viking warriors and all that stuff, and they want to go back to that sort of like warrior ideal of the ancient Germanics or something like that. I always think about like, well, you know what? Those warriors probably weren't, that welcome in that civilized society. They had to do things to come back, because of course these people understood things like PTSD. And one of the ways that they understood PTSD was that you have to treat that. How do we treat that? Well, we treat it with ritual. So that's an important lesson to learn too. You can't just shrug about the whole notion of coming back from war. You have to come back sort of reborn. You have to come back and then undergo some kind of reintegration ritual where we are all now aware that you've been to war and it's okay, and you're now reintegrated into society. And we're be mindful about those things that could, for instance, potentially be a problem between having been in that warrior situation and now being in a peace situation again.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful book by Sebastian Junger called Tribe that's about the Native Americans have a ritual exactly like you're describing. And the book goes into just examinations of that reintegration into society. And it makes sense to me that other cultures would have had a similar way, particularly when they were in their more tribal states as well. So
yeah, no, it is that's basically a way of taking care of your people, you know.
Yeah.
And expecting somebody to live their entire life as a warrior is not taking care of them. Not these types of people. They wouldn't have seen that as a particularly great fate. And I think that's also part of this, the expression, or they're expressing this in context of those Odinic warriors who suffer those really bad fates. They don't perceive that as the best option for life. That doesn't mean that they didn't respect it a lot, but no Viking who survived the journey spent their whole life going back and forth like that. We see that in the saga literature all over. There's a period of time in your life where you do that. And then you have amassed enough wealth, you have amassed enough status and honor in society to come back and build yourself a nice little farm and have a family. And being that lucky person, one of the few who can come back, right? You of course settle down and try to live the most normal life as possible according to the standards of that type of society, right?
Oh, that makes so much sense. Thank you so much for talking to me today. This is, we went really deep. I knew we were going to have a good conversation, but boy, we got into all kinds of stuff. And I think it's wonderful how just what on the surface seems like a very simple story about Boulder reveals all these layers and depths to Northern European culture and just, I don't know, all of it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is so incredibly awesome with this mythology. I mean, when you can connect the dots like that, then bam, that all of a sudden you're like you're exposed to this wealth of knowledge and these all of these stories that say so much more than just the words on the page that you could read, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I did. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. Where can people find you, your channel?
Yeah, so of course you can find me on YouTube. Just Google my name, Mathias Nordvig. You could also find me on my website, www.nordicmythologychannel.com. And you can find the podcast that I do with Horns of Odin on Spotify and iTunes and various other outlets of that kind. And yeah, that I think covers it.
Thank you, Mathias. I really enjoyed talking with you today. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise. If you're interested in getting a limited edition print of The Death of Boulder, you can go to fatefulsigns.com. Only 15 prints will be made at 18 inch by 24 inch, and at the time of this recording, only 11 remain.
For those of you watching this video, thank you for joining Mathias and I today. I'm Sam Flegal, and I hope you enjoyed watching me paint and learning a bit more about Boulder from Mathias. You can find my YouTube channel at Sam Flegal Art if you want to see more process and lore videos. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you who support my art at the Fateful Signs Patreon. You make videos like this possible. You all are amazing. If you liked this video, head on over to fatefulsigns.com and sign up for the newsletter. You'll get a PDF copy of the first chapter from the Illustrated Hávamál when you do. Thank you.